in which case I'll commence. So thank you for your introduction and for having me. So yes, my name's Tim Sykes. I'm an ecologist with the Environment Agency, and I'm also a part-time PhD researcher at the University of Southampton. And I'm looking at our relationship with chalk stream headwaters that are temporary and called winterbournes. I'd like to kick off by acknowledging my funders, who are my employer, the Environment Agency, and also the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust on behalf of the Test and Itchen Catchment Partnership. I also want to acknowledge up front the importance of my, can I go back one? The importance of my participants, without whom I would literally have no data. I'm really privileged and honoured to for them to have shared their hopes and aspirations, their views, their secrets, and their trust with me. So it's been a real privilege to be a researcher in this case. I knew my PhD would be stretching, but I didn't really appreciate quite how important it would be for me in terms of building relationships with people. So I'm going to paddle through some of my findings to date. I'm going to talk about situated walking interviews and solicited diaries are the two methods I've used so far. I'm going to briefly talk about cultural ecosystem services and how they might vary across the different phases or states of winterbournes. And then I'm going to get into psychological well-being. And I'll introduce that now as comprising two key elements: hedonic well-being, such as moods, how happy or sad you might be, and eudaimonic well-being, which are, for example, life purpose. But I will define these things more later on. And in all the cases, I'm going to talk about what my participants have shared with me, examples of having these types of well-being. And at the end, I'm just going to touch upon things that maybe some of my research could influence how we apply it and how we relate to winterbournes going forwards. But that's at the end. So for now, here's an introduction to the two methods I've used. The map on the left, or the map on both sides, the blue is the extent of chalk in England, and superimposed upon that are the rivers. The map on the left shows the catchments in which I conducted situated walking interviews with 29 participants. I actually did more than that, but these are the ones I'm reporting at this stage. In orange are the winterbournes which we actually worked on. On the right are the winterbournes in which I asked different participants to maintain a diary for a year in which they record their relationship with their winterbourne. And tonight I'm going to talk about results that have arisen through both of these methods. The diary method was particularly interesting because people sent me their diaries, sometimes at least one per month, but often many more. And they sent them to me in a number of different formats, sometimes collages, sometimes incredibly artful. Sometimes they would be emails from the riverbank, and sometimes they might even just be texts. In this case, a mum waiting for her kids on the school run most days, and she's still talking about how that her winterbourne looks magical. So for me, it was really interesting. I had 36 pen pals, as it were. Every day of the week, I would be getting text or photographs. I appreciate it wasn't quite like that in return for my participants. Whilst we did have a degree of correspondence, it was their diaries to keep. And so it was primarily a one-way relationship. But I did enjoy getting to see photographs. People would send them to me, sometimes without a diary even. They just wanted to share their moment with me by their winterbourne, knowing that I would be interested. So here are some of the cultural ecosystem services that my participants talked about. Now, cultural ecosystem services is really a dry subject. It's an academic construct. It's a framework which is quite handy to try to categorize the different ways that participants had and express their relationship with their winterbourne. Nobody actually talked in these terms, though, so it is quite an academic. It's not a very real life framework, but it is a handy structure to use. And in this case, I'm presenting the results from the situated walking interviews. So I'll talk you through this. So along the top are the 21 cultural ecosystem services, from nature appreciation on the left to bequest value on the right. Down the side are 5 phases of the winterbourne: flowing, drying, ponded, drying, wetting. Another category I called all phases, and that was where participants talked about the phases collectively and not individually. And then the final category I called general was where people were inspired by their winterbourne to talk in more generic ways, perhaps about their world views, perhaps they were talking about the rights of nature, for example, without expressly referring to their winterbourne. And down on the right-hand side is the key, and the darker the square, the more participants referred to that cultural ecosystem service in any one of the 7 categories. So that's what you're looking at. It's clear to see that of the 5 phases, flowing was the one that people referred to the most, the widest diversity of cultural ecosystem services. But of those 21 services, 3 were mentioned in all 7 categories: nature appreciation, sense of place, and social capital. And others were mentioned most of the time, such as aesthetic beauty and stewardship. Only one cultural ecosystem service was mentioned by all 29 participants, and that was sense of place, when referring in a general sense to all of the categories. And I think that's important. That all category phase is one where many people, they weren't referring to specific categories, they were phases. They were talking about the winterbourne in the round, often with reference to cycles such as the annual hydrological cycle, the ebb and flow of the winterbourne, or other cycles such as seasonal cycles. But each one of those cultural ecosystem services varied across the phases. So it's not as simple as saying people just felt nature appreciation in each phase. They felt different dimensions of cultural ecosystem services across the phases. So I'm not going to read all of these out. You'll have read half of it already by now. But for example, in the ponded phase, people enjoyed being able to see close up very large, dense congregations of numerous macroinvertebrates, gammarus, for example. There might be hundreds in a small pond, and people could get up close to it and see them. And they also enjoyed watching congregations of birds coming and eating those invertebrates. So in the ponded phase, they were up close and personal and observing unusual congregations of birds. In the flowing phase, they might not be in the river, but they might be enjoying seeing the wildlife such as trout, for example. So you're seeing different nature appreciation in different phases, not surprisingly. And perhaps the one that might surprise people is the general category, where some people perceive the winterbourne itself to be a form of nature, to be alive. And that I classified as nature appreciation. They saw their winterbourne as being a living, sentient being, part of the wildlife of their surroundings. And now I'm just going to show you a couple of slides about perspective. Again, quotes that you'll read yourself. But these winterbournes gave people the opportunity for quiet reflection where they could gain experience about and experience tranquility and gain perspective about the things that are important to them in life, which includes death, includes world affairs, and includes where we sit in the vast universe. So they gained a perspective on life. The person here in the right-hand side, that quote, that's really interesting because that person was suffering evidently quite a severe depression during this process. So whilst they're talking about their world seemingly dead, they're not talking about the season in February when there aren't usually a lot of flowers and things, because in fact their winterbourne was flowing and it had vibrant green weeds in it. It was very evidently the winterbourne was alive. It was their perception of their place in the world where they were feeling dead, in terms of, not literally, but in terms of their mood. And their depression, and yet it still gave them hope that life will spring back again, and they meant that their life will spring back again. And here's a few more quotes along the similar lines. So I used quotes like this as evidence that people were experiencing opportunities to gain perspective in life. And these are my interpretation of those quotes. Oh, I thought I had deleted this one, but I'm now going to go through three really quick slides. Don't try to read it all. Perhaps in this one, pick out the bottom one. Look at intrinsic value. These are quotes for each one of the 21 cultural ecosystem services. There are going to be 3 slides with lots of quotes on. Just pick out one item per table. And again, if you look at the intrinsic values one at the end, again, this person is seeing that the winterbourne deserves to survive in its own right. And I picked that out because rights of nature is something that's gathering pace and prominence amongst lovers of rivers. And my participants were experiencing that and relating to that 3 or 4 years ago. Here's there's perspective there again, somebody seeing where we sit as humans in the greater cosmos. A classic example of gaining perspective on life, how small and insignificant we are. So I'm going to rush through this. So I know you won't have had time to read them all, but don't worry. I think on this slide, I would pick out stewardship. There was a very, very strong sense of stewardship amongst my participants. Everybody recognized that they might be an owner, but actually they were only a temporary custodian or steward of their winterbourne. And they really wanted to look after it, either for future generations of people or in terms of intrinsic value, to look after it in its own right for its own future. So now I'm going to come back to mental health. Of the 21 cultural ecosystem services, it was mentioned by the walking participants in a general way. Here are some examples. People talking about it's great to be alive, and that's a real relational value. They really value spending time by their winterbourne. And earlier I talked about social capital and connectivity between people. Social media, for example, in many villages with winterbournes would really light up they'd catch on fire, one participant said, when the winterbourne is active. It's a bush telegraph. So in terms of psychological well-being, our mental health can be looked at positively in a couple of ways. There's hedonic well-being, and it refers to psychologically feeling good. And that comes down to mood, such as happiness. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Those feelings tend to be relatively fleeting. One can these moods kind of come and go, and you will often have plural moods at the same time. You might be so ecstatic that you've seen an egret on your winterbourne, but you might be really upset and angry because somebody's left some litter there as well. So in one walk, you might experience a vast array of moods, which are relatively fleeting. Psychologically functioning well, on the other hand, eudaimonic well-being tends to be feelings that are much more profound in importance, but you may not consciously think of them in the same way as a mood might be uplifting. One tends not to walk around thinking, oh, I'm feeling a real sense of purpose and meaning today. But when you stop to think about things, these types of feelings can be not only profound, but long lasting. They can really be important in your quality of life. And there are three elements of eudaimonic well-being that I want to talk about today: life purpose and meaning, personal growth, and self-discovery. And I'm going to show you evidence that I'm interpreting of participants feeling and reporting those profound senses. But first, I'm just going to briefly talk about each of the phases. So in its flowing phase, a winterbourne is very much have the characteristics of a perennial chalk stream. It can have an ethereal feel about it. It will have that crystal clear water and the colourful substrate, the different coloured flints and chalk. The reflection and refraction of light on the water is incredibly beautiful and mesmerising for many people. And they're incredibly biodiverse. The picture on the right here, the Lavant stream in West Sussex, it's got all that classic ranunculus and lots of herbs on the banks. And it looks just like a perennial chalk stream, but it's a winterbourne. So for some of the year, that's completely bone dry. But in its flowing phase, it's very much like a perennial chalk stream. So if you're not familiar with winterbournes, hopefully that gives you a good picture of what they're like in the flowing phase. But in the dry phase, they are a real contrast. For much of the year, they may just be literally the bare bones of the river, as some people describe it. Just the sediment, the substrate is exposed for the whole year. Other winterbournes will be occupied by vegetation, grasses, oeanthids, hemlock water dropwort, for example, will occupy the channel, and it will be vegetated over, but you'll still have the channel form. And for many people, this is a time of grief. They really don't, they think their river has died. It's something that people talk about with great passion. They feel that the river has died. They're feeling a genuine grief for it was what a lot of people described. And the transitional phases between that flowing and drying can stir a lot of emotions in people, can really affect mood. On the left here is the River Till. You can see the pool. It's often in a hot summer, so the water temperature will be high. The concentration of nutrients will be high, so it'll be full of algae, and it will be full of, sometimes thousands of macroinvertebrates will be congregating in these pools, slowly suffocating. And the vegetation in the channel will be rotting. It will often have a stench to it of decay. And in fact, It is a time literally of death and decay. And again, this is something that people feel very strongly about, especially when fish are caught. And in terms of stewardship, a lot of people will get into the channel at this stage and try to save fish, move them to a perennial reach, for example. So although it's associated with death and decay, it's also a period where some people still find interest. So it is a time when you can get in close and inspect those macroinvertebrates congregating in these tiny pools. And it's also a time when large numbers of piscivorous birds congregate to feed. And so it's unusual in your back kitchen window, for example, you might look out and you might see 8 or 9 herons or egrets feeding on the fish. That in itself is quite interesting. And many people also appreciated that it was part of the cycle of life, that the death of the fish meant life for the birds. And so, although it's a time of death and decay, for some people, they saw the positive side of it. They saw what it meant for life in a grand cycle. In contrast, almost everybody loved the wetting phase. This transition from dry to flowing again can happen often over a period of weeks, and the channel will start flowing. Often it will start flowing from the bottom upwards, but it will also start flowing from the top downwards. Many people will drive up their river valley every day to go to bridges to see where has the river got to today. And on those bridges, you might meet people you know, or you might people you don't know, but have a common interest in the river. And so you're building these social connections on these bridges. Bridges are really important. Traditionally they're seen as places you go from, perhaps from life to death and things like. They have all kinds of metaphors. But actually, a lot of people in winterbournes go and stop on the bridge. They're not using it as a corridor. They're stopping on it to give a vantage point over their winterbourne. And they'll travel the bridges, multiple bridges in one day to see where the water's got to. And often, as I say, it will creep down over many days. And again, social media is really on fire at this time of year in many villages. Where has it got to today? Conversely, if it happens really quickly, it can happen in a matter of hours. The river can go from dry to flowing. And especially if that happens overnight, people are desperately sad. They've missed that transition. They're quite upset when it happens overnight. So to experience this transition is something that's really important to people. And I would kind of call it peak joy. So in terms of those moods, and I talked about hedonic well-being earlier, when I asked people to complete their diary over the course of a year, I asked them each time they wrote a diary entry to also complete a questionnaire, a survey, rating their mood. So along the bottom, you'll see there's 10 moods. There are 5 positive and 5 negative, and they're in pairs. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the scale from not at all, 1, to 7, totally. And you'll see that the negative moods are all scored very, very low. Their median value, actually, they were all scored at not at all. There was a little bit of variation, but generally speaking, people did not feel sad. They did not feel negative during about their winterbourne during the year. Conversely, the positive scores all scored much higher, but they also had a great deal of variability. Their median scores, their average scores, were moderate or above, but clearly a number of people rated them not at all or only a little. So I'm interpreting this, as I say, as people not feeling negative at all, generally speaking, but feeling more or less positive. And if we took two of those moods, we took if I take the first pair, so there's anxious on the left, and the second graph on the right shows at ease. And then I've broken it down into how people felt across the different phases. You'll see that the scores on the right, the positive scores, are generally higher than those on the left, the negative mood. But actually, across the phases, within each mood, they don't vary a great deal. There's no statistical significant variance across the phases. That means that people felt generally not very anxious all of the time, or they felt at ease, relatively speaking, most of the time. So the phase didn't determine how people felt. It was bigger than that. Many people considered the phases in the round or collectively. They thought of their winterbourne as a cycle of phases, and any one phase on its own was not that important. Now I'm going to show you a series of quotes relating to the eudaimonic psychological well-being, the functioning well. I'm not going to read them out to you. I'm going to leave you to read those. The people in these quotes who gave me these quotes, I'm interpreting them as being referring to a sense of purpose and meaning. People say that volunteering in a citizen science project in their winterbourne gave them an additional focus in life which they found meaningful. So they are finding, through participating in citizen science schemes like the Watercress and Winterbournes project, is giving people a sense of purpose and meaning. Now, I think we're probably safe to assume that we knew that if we were to think about it for perennial chalk streams. But people still feel that sense by volunteering for schemes related to winterbournes. That kind of underlines for me, I think, the importance of schemes such as the Watercress and Winterbournes project, in that it's more than gathering data to influence decisions. Actually, participating in schemes is itself an outcome of the Watercress and Winterbournes project. Another element of psychologically functioning well was learning and education. And not surprisingly, people felt very strongly about that, again, mostly through participating in citizen science projects on winterbournes. So a reference here to riverfly monitoring. An interesting dimension of this wasn't just that people were learning technical aspects about invertebrates, for example, although they did really enjoy doing that, and they would host dinner parties and bore their guests silly while they talked about how they could identify microinvertebrates through microscopes and things like that, how many hairs this particular species might have. And these are things that they've learned through participating in schemes such as the Watercress and Winterbournes project. But it was more than that. Many of the participants were retired. They had reached a stage in life where they described they didn't expect to be learning a great deal more in life. It's not that they didn't want to, but often retired people will feel parked or sidelined. And so they really enjoyed having coaches and mentors, people from the Watercress and Winterbournes project, for example, to show them how to identify species down a microscope, to provide the microscope in the first place, to thereby facilitating that learning. So citizen science projects in the round, such as Watercress and Winterbournes, were really allowing people to not just learn and facts, but to grow themselves, to develop as people. And here's the third aspect of eudaimonic well-being, self-discovery. I'm just going to give you a moment to read that. So again, I'm interpreting evidence such as this. This is my data. I'm interpreting this as examples of people who are discovering something about themselves, perhaps literally them in the landscape. Again, an element of perspective. Um, and the person at the bottom there is finding, after they've retired, they're finding a peaceful and satisfied existence through participating in citizen science projects um, based on temporary streams, on these chalk winterbournes. So again, really important. And collectively, these elements of eudaimonic well-being can have a really profound influence on people's lives, life satisfaction, and 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 so we mustn't underestimate the importance of these projects, but also of these places. So, what is it about winterbournes that people particularly are interested in? I think the you can take it as read that the flowing winterbourne, the water, the refraction, the biodiversity, people just love that. Everybody loves that. But one thing that distinguished people who liked dry winterbournes from those who don't was their curiosity. They actually got in it. And I think that's really important. A lot of people stand by a river and look in it. You might swim in a river when it's got water in it, but who gets into a river when it's dry? Not everybody. And those that did found different dimensions of interest to pique their curiosity. You might find wildlife. In the middle there is a newt I found under a flint in a hot August in the Candover Brook. Actually touching the flints, thinking about the geology. You know, I think we're all familiar with chalk, and chalk is comprised of the exoskeletons of prehistoric life. But flint, how does that made? How is that associated with chalk? There's quite a few people out there handling flint, and when you look at it, they're wondering where it came from, how was it formed? And then naturally, they also start to think about the uses of flint. And a lot of people who get into winterbournes, their mind starts to wander into how Neolithic people, prehistoric people, thought of these places and how did they use them? What did ancestors make of streams that dried? These are the types of things that people think about when they're in a dry winterbourne. They also piqued, their curiosity is piqued to see evidence of geomorphological processes, to see how flints have been moved, sediment has been deposited, woody debris has been left, evidence of bankside erosion. It's really quite interesting to see how a river has has affected the form of a channel when you're standing inside that channel, especially if it's a really deep one. Some of these winterbournes, the channel might be more than 6 feet deep. So you might literally be lost in this hollow way, as some people have described it. And then you get to observe and handle the geomorphological features. And of course, fossils. Some people have found fossils and they absolutely love that. It's really important to people. So curiosity is important. So that's the end of my presentation regarding what I've found so far. Now I'm just going to venture into what that might mean. What might we do with that knowledge? So with regards to education, chalk stream literacy, for example, needs to celebrate the dry or the temporary headwaters. Many winterbournes are unique because they cease to flow, not because they look like perennial chalk streams in their flowing phase. They're unique because they're different. So we really need to celebrate that uniqueness. So we need to get in them. Maybe we could go rock dipping instead of pond dipping. Maybe we could look at dry creeks and playgrounds. That's been done in many arid parts of the world, in the Midwest America, for example. You might have playgrounds with dry creeks where kids can interact with the rocks. It's not the water that it's important, it's the rocks. We should celebrate their wildlife. They have specialist wildlife. The terrestrial macroinvertebrates that live in these winterbournes when they're dry are just as nationally rare or scarce as the aquatic invertebrates that live in them when they're flowing. So when they're dry, they're not dead, which some people still feel they are. In fact, they're very much alive. So we need to really celebrate that. We need to get that message out there, I think. We need to normalize dry streams. Who takes photographs of dry streams? The only time you see them on social media is when people are lamenting the fact it's dry. Often it's because of over abstraction or climate change. And yet many of these winterbournes, they're naturally dry, and we need to get that literacy balanced. And we need to get people out there participating, getting in them, maybe having school diaries about the natural cycles of winterbournes, and not just to appreciate it when it's flowing. I gave a talk to this group a couple of years ago, and I highlighted the importance of understanding that our aquifer has a biodiversity interest too. And so I'm just going to quickly show two slides. So we're all familiar probably with, excuse me. We're all familiar with gammarus, for example, the shrimp that live in chalk streams in their flowing phase. But actually there's a whole specific biota, stygobites, that live in the aquifer. And just like on a David Attenborough program in a cave in Borneo, you might see an amphibian that's white and has pink eyes because it doesn't need to see, it can't see. Well, so is the same with our groundwater invertebrates that live in our chalk. They're white, many of them are eyeless, and you can sample them because so many of our villages in our headwaters relied on wells to gain access to water, including the one on the left here is in somebody's kitchen, and the one on the right, somebody's back garden. It's very easy to sample those macro invertebrates from the aquifer, and you can identify them in a tray, just like you would if you're doing kick samples in a river, and you can see the life that's in our aquifers. And it's a way of literally bringing our aquifers to life for people. We need to appreciate the groundwater that sustains not only the ebb and flow of winterbournes, but of course sustains chalk streams in the round. And then what about river restoration? Much of our river restoration is already focused on making chalk streams more interesting to people, not just in terms of enhancing biodiversity, but visually straightening, putting meanders in straight channels, for example. And increasingly, we're starting to restore winterbournes. But what more could we do to allow people to enjoy many of those benefits that I've described to you? Well, access is a key thing. Many of our chalk streams and our winterbournes are privately owned and inaccessible to the public, inaccessible to most people. So a lot of those benefits that my participants have described as enjoying and benefiting from, in terms of their mental health, for example, those benefits are largely available unequally. There are social injustices. We need to have access to these places so more people can enjoy those benefits. And then this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but if we want more people to enjoy the opportunity for a perspective, for example, those slides I showed earlier about people enjoying solace and gaining perspective in the tranquility of Winterbourne, then why not offer them somewhere to sit to do so? And so, tongue in cheek slightly, but in river restoration, we talk about putting large woody debris in channels, large woody materials in channels to enhance hydrogeomorphological processes and improve biodiversity. Well, why don't we use large woody debris for people too, to gain perspective, for example? This bench is in memory of a friend and colleague of mine, which is why I show it. But these benches, could really be really important to people. And especially if we could place benches on bridges where people get to that unique perspective of a watercourse and where they can meet other people. I think if we could provide benches on bridges over all rivers, we would be doing a great service to society. So that's where I'd like to finish, and I will stop